Welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Where the state is absent or weak, non-state actors such as religious movements and institutions, traditional ethnic polities, militant organizations, or combinations of all three take its place, some for better, some for worse. Those are the words of former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria John Campbell from his new book, Nigeria and the Nation State, Rethinking Diplomacy with the Post-Colonial World. In it, he argues that U.S. diplomats should focus more on working with traditional religious and local leaders where real power often rests, and less with foreign ministries and weak heads of state. John Campbell is currently Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. John, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you.
I wanted to start with a line in the introduction to your book that jumped out at me. You wrote, "The question is not whether international involvement in Nigeria and Africa will increase, it is under what terms and how. Why is it an inevitability that international engagement with African countries will increase in the future?"
Well, let's start with the most fundamental issue, which is demography. Let's take one specific example. Nigeria presently has 214 million people. By year 2050, the credible projections are its population will number between 400 and 450 million people, and it will have displaced the United States as the third largest country in the world by population. Most of the world's population gain, in fact, between now and 2050 will be in Africa. An exception is Pakistan and Bangladesh, where the population is also increasing rapidly. Add to an explosive growth in population is very rapid urbanization. But urbanization without the necessary infrastructure to accommodate the new residents. Added to that is the fact that in Nigeria, for example, in 1960, the country exported food. Now it must import food. In other words, Nigeria cannot feed itself at present. It's very hard to see how it can feed 400 or 450 million people at mid-century. This would imply that there are likely to be significant out-migrations from not just Nigeria, but also all of West Africa. And we have seen how destabilizing mass migration can be on our own southern border, in the Mediterranean from the Middle East. That's number one. Number two, security questions. Radical Islamist groups have established themselves straight across the Sahel, in the Horn, and now in Mozambique. These movements are, without exception, hostile to the United States. The issue becomes whether they threaten the security of the United States or whether they simply threaten our interests. In principle, they all aim at the overthrow of the secular governments, all of which are weak, but most of which, to a greater or lesser extent, are partners of the United States. Hence, I think we have to anticipate that as security deteriorates, there will be calls for the United States to become more active militarily in Africa. Let me note, in conjunction with that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has raised the possibility that the French will withdraw from West Africa. Right now, the French have the largest foreign military presence in West Africa, And as we saw in Mali in 2011, it was the French presence that was essentially the finger in the dike that held back what appeared to be a very rapid Islamic takeover of the country.
You open your book with a bit of a warning for the United States that as it is drawn into military engagements in Africa a bit more, there's a risk of repeating the same mistakes that it made in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Why is that of such great concern?
It's of concern because in the case of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, what you had was sudden American involvement in parts of the world with which we were unfamiliar and with which we had no previous experience or no long-term previous experience. And in fact, we didn't have the granular knowledge that should underpin good policy making. A consequence of that was that we made a whole host of policy mistakes. Well, American involvement in Africa has not been long term. It's relatively new, and my concern is a lack of the kind of expertise about Africa that's necessary for good policy making.
Can you talk a little bit more about the approach that most U.S. administrations have taken, many governments in the West for that matter, in their relations with Africa, and what was lacking from that?
Essentially, before the wave of African independence from roughly 1958, when Ghana became independent, into the early 60s, essentially American relations with Africa were a subset of the much broader and much more important relationship with the colonial powers, with France, the UK, with Germany before World War I, with Belgium. And this continued even after World War II, because the colonial powers were all close allies of ours in the Cold War. So before the wave of independence, essentially, American policy towards Africa was to defer to the colonial powers, and we played virtually no role at all in Africa becoming independent. After independence, our policy was to encourage African states to take charge of their own security, encourage and facilitate African states taking charge of their own economic development, and then doing what we could to ward the continent off from the Cold War. The latter point, most of the time, was successful, but not always. Congo and Angola are examples. That's policy. In terms of actual diplomatic engagement, our embassies, with only a few exceptions, tended to be extremely small, based obviously in the capital. There was, and still is, almost no training of American diplomats in African languages, so that our diplomatic infrastructure in Africa has been underdeveloped compared with other parts of the world.
You saw this problem firsthand yourself as a foreign service officer, starting your career, I believe, in the mid-1970s. Tell us a little bit about the kinds of experiences that you had and how that shaped your thinking about U.S. engagement with Africa.
Two stories. My early assignments were Lyon, Paris, Geneva, and the department. My academic background is in 17th century English history. I was sitting happily in Geneva, a French-speaking post, when I got a call from the then Director General of the Foreign Service proposing that I go as political counselor to Lagos. Why Lagos? Because the political counselor in Lagos had suddenly been transferred to Johannesburg because the consul general in Johannesburg had retired. So, when I went to Nigeria in 1988, responsible for the political reporting from the country. I had never been to Africa before and knew absolutely nothing about it. Story number one. Story number two, when more than a decade later, I went back to Nigeria as ambassador. Our embassy was either the largest in Africa or one of two or three of the largest. And yet, in my embassy, 1/3 of the positions were unfilled. They were vacant. Other than myself, there were only two other senior officers in the entire embassy. All of the rest of the American diplomats were junior or at best mid-level, which meant they had very little experience.
And this was something that is common to postings across Africa.
It is indeed common, but in places where the embassies are extremely small, where, for example, you may have an ambassador, 5 or 6 officers, and then say 20 or 30 locally engaged staff. If there is a vacancy in an embassy an unfilled vacancy in an embassy that is that small, it has a real impact on operations.
Now, part of the flaws that you talk about in your book, in terms of how the United States and other Western countries deal with a lot of African countries, but also post-colonial countries and other parts of the global South, has to do with the history of those countries, how their states were formed, and the relationship those states have with the people they govern. Talk a little bit about that mismatch that you identify in your book between the assumptions that Western governments make about how those states work and the reality on the ground.
This, I think, is key. In the case of Africa, the African states as they now exist were, with only one exception, creations of European colonial administrations. The exception is Ethiopia. Ethiopia was, of course, an empire which was able to maintain its independence, except for a brief period before the Second World War when it was occupied by the Italians. But otherwise, the states are essentially colonial creations. As such, most of them lack a kind of organic connection between the government and the people that are being governed. In Nigeria, for example, people will often say that Nigeria is still essentially a colonial entity. It's a colonial entity in that the British left, but were simply replaced by indigenous elites that were every bit as exploitative as those that left. The lack of national identity, it varies, of course, from country to country, but by and large, it's pretty weak. I was talking last week with a Nigerian woman who said to me, "Look, I know what it means to be a part of an extended family. I know what it means to be a Christian. I know what it means to be a Yoruba. I have no idea what it means to be a Nigerian." And that is a reality which our diplomacy, which historically is focused on chiefs of state or heads of government, foreign ministries, and national assemblies, that is a reality that we tend to overlook, simply because of the way we're structured.
It reminds me of a story I remember hearing from one of my professors who had done a lot of development work in Chad. And she said that if you go far enough north in Chad, people there will ask you, "Oh, you must be from Chad."
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that very much rings true.
So what then is the better way forward? There's a phrase you use in your book, a decentralized approach to diplomacy, essentially taking the engagement side a little bit less from the top and shifting it more toward the grassroots to civil society. What does that look like?
What it looks like is opening a dialogue with the movers and shakers at the grassroots level, who often command more credibility than government officials do. Who are we talking about? Well, it varies from country to country. In Nigeria, the country I know best, it includes Pentecostal preachers, Roman Catholic cardinals and archbishops. It includes traditional rulers. It includes malams and imams. It includes, in some cases, governors. The third richest man in Nigeria, apparently, is a Pentecostal preacher. And he has a television show that regularly has millions of viewers. Certainly when I was there, and he was active when I was there, not only did I never have a conversation with him, I don't believe anybody in the embassy ever did either. So here is one of the people who is most influential in a huge country of enormous importance to the United States that we simply had no dialogue with. I submit that's pretty dangerous.
Why is that?
Because it means that we're setting ourselves up to be blindsided. Sources of information, actually this is true throughout Africa, with the exception of South Africa, sources of information are extremely limited. Information is something that you hoard, you don't share. Information is power. And you literally will not necessarily know what's going on unless you're on the ground. A concrete example of what I'm talking about, we don't really know how many victims of COVID-19 there have been in Nigeria. But we do know that in the city of Kano late last spring, there was an explosion in the number of freshly dug graves. In other words, there was evidence of a spike in mortality. If we'd had somebody on the ground, presumably they could have gone and talked to the grave diggers about what these people were dying of. Add to the fact that there is no mandatory registry of deaths in Nigeria or in other African countries for that matter. So there's an awful lot going on that could impact directly on us that we don't have a clue about.
What is it exactly that's holding the United States government and the State Department and the diplomatic corps back from pursuing this kind of approach that you're talking about?
Basically, three things. First of all, of course, a dialogue has to be maintained with the chief of state, the foreign ministry, and the National Assembly. So I'm not saying that we should simply wholesale abolish embassies. What I am suggesting is that there should be a redeployment of resources to the local level and a greater focus and emphasis on the grassroots. Now, that takes money. In the grand scheme of things, not a whole lot of money. And certainly compared to policy mistakes that we made in Vietnam or Iraq, it's dirt cheap. But still, it does take money. Secondly, there's security issues. Now, we know perfectly well how to protect our diplomats, and so too do the Israelis, for example. But that also requires money. Then there is what I would call a general culture that is extremely averse to risk. What do I mean by that? Take, for example, what happened in the aftermath of the killing of our ambassador in Benghazi. That episode was used for partisan political purposes to attack the then administration. Or take Black Hawk Down in Somalia, where the deaths of a bit more than a dozen American military personnel led to essentially a wholesale withdrawal of much of what we were doing in Africa, and arguably contributed to our inability to stop the Rwandan genocide. Or take the killing of 4 American soldiers in Niger about 3 years ago, and the outcry that produced. All of these killings were tragic, no question about that. But all of them had, I would suggest, a disproportionate impact on policy. It also goes a little bit further than that. If, in fact, a diplomat is killed in the course of action, the ambassador involved goes before something called an accountability review board, which in effect operates on the basis that the ambassador is guilty until proven innocent. Happily, that is likely to change in the near future, as there is bipartisan legislation pending on the Hill that would change it. But it's been in effect now for probably a decade or so. And you put all these things together, and there is an extreme risk-averse culture that is anchored in our diplomacy, and which often translates in diplomats rarely venturing outside of our embassies, which are in effect fortresses.
The kind of approach you're talking about does require resources, as you pointed out. It strikes me that it also requires forethought and strategic planning in advance of events that might, throw the United States off its guard and cause diplomats to scramble. I'm thinking of the coup that happened in Mali recently, for instance. There are a number of other examples that we could point to. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yes, I do. I would say very much that's a fair assessment. That's the problem. Effective diplomacy requires a granular knowledge and understanding of what's going on in the host country, and that in turn requires dialogue with a very broad segment of interested people.
I want to also ask you about this very pronounced narrative we saw during the Trump administration that portrayed Africa mainly as a theater of great power competition. We heard this very overtly from John Bolton, for instance, the then national security advisor, warning that China is making deep inroads in many countries, Russia too, to a lesser extent than China, but still building up these relationships, and that more U.S. engagement was necessary to counter those U.S. adversaries. Could you talk a little bit about how that approach was received by African countries and why it was flawed?
Let's start with a fundamental issue that was often overlooked. Yes, China and Russia are increasingly active in Africa. So too is Turkey, the Gulf, India. In other words, there are a host of outside actors that were not present, say, 20 years ago, but are there now. Moving from that generalization to the specific case of China, there was also a view that somehow or another Chinese involvement in Africa was essentially exploitative. That, I think, is a dubious generalization. Close studies that have been made, for example, of Chinese loans to African states show that they were, by and large, at market rate, and by and large went to finance infrastructure projects that the African countries that were involved wanted. I think the previous administration's casting of Chinese involvement in Africa in a kind of retro Cold War framework way oversimplified a much more complicated relationship. Before we move from the Chinese, one very quick observation. It depends what Chinese you're talking about. For example, Taiwanese Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese have been active in West Africa, particularly Nigeria, since the colonial period, and they know very well how to operate in an African environment. The the criticism of Chinese involvement tends to focus on the Beijing Chinese and corporations that are owned by the Chinese military.
When you talk about Taiwanese Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese being involved in parts of West Africa, how exactly do you mean?
Oh, they have businesses there, and they've had businesses there.
So this is non-government engagement, in other words?
No, it's not government engagement. There was a large Chinese embassy across the street from the American embassy in Abuja, but it was certainly not as large as ours or as large as the British. The Chinese engagement, certainly in Nigeria, was primarily small private enterprises. In Nigeria, if you want to go out for a fancy meal, you generally go to a Chinese restaurant, and those restaurants will have often been there for 50 years.
That kind of engagement at the private sector level, at the civil society level, what the State Department calls people-to-people ties, strikes me as another area of the U.S. approach to Africa that kind of has been lacking lately. It's been such a focus on security and military-to-military ties that really important aspect of diplomacy has been overlooked.
I couldn't agree more. When I was ambassador, I met a group of people from Iowa who had organized an exchange program whereby they received in their homes for 1 year high school students from almost all Muslim from northern Nigeria. And amongst other things, those host families ensured that their Nigerian guests got to the mosque on Friday. I interviewed them before they went out, and I interviewed them when they came back. That was the sum total of the USG's involvement in the whole operation. And yet, those returned high school students were almost like yeast in dough in their communities. They demolished nicely the presumption that the Americans somehow or another were hostile to Islam. And here we're talking about facilitating. We're not talking about paying for. All we're doing is talking about encouraging and facilitating private American groups who really do a very nice job with this sort of thing.
And that's something we could see a lot more of, in your view?
I think we absolutely have to. There are also professional organizations. The National Bar Association, which is primarily African American in membership, I think is well placed to strengthen its ties with the Nigeria Bar Association. And what could be better? Because both groups are interested in the rule of law.
Speaking of the rule of law, this is an issue that I think it's fair to say we saw neglected quite a bit during the Trump administration, but that the new administration under President Joe Biden has taken a bit more of an interest in, alongside things like democracy promotion, certain human rights issues. How much encouragement do you draw from some of those early steps that the Biden administration has taken, and what more would you like to see from the president in this in those spheres?
I'm encouraged by it. Here is where I come from. I would like a lot more U.S. support for the rule of law, which would translate into things like support for local judiciaries, and a lot less focus on the mechanics of elections. Elections in many African countries are not really a measure of what the population wants. Instead, they're a kind of pageant carried out by rival elites. In other words, elections don't have the same meaning as we impute to them. So I would reduce the focus on elections and increase the focus on rule of law and the judiciary.
There were a few very prominent examples, I know, in the past few years where we saw independent judiciaries in countries like Kenya and Malawi exercise their power and order reruns of elections that were deemed fraudulent. Do you think we could see more cases like that coming up in the future?
I would hope so.
There's this other problem of the way that Africa is often represented in Western discourse in the media as well, of these conflicts that we see portrayed largely along religious lines as being conflicts against Christians versus Muslims or other sectarian divisions. Why is that kind of a flawed way to look at these developments?
Back to the general lack of granular knowledge and understanding. Most of the conflicts that we see involve water and land. Sometimes the fault lines are the same as those between religions. In the middle belt of Nigeria, notoriously, it's farmers and herders who are Muslim and usually Fulani, and farmers who are Christian and usually from minority tribes. But the root of the conflict is not Christian versus Muslim, and it is not minority tribe versus Hausa or Fulani. It's basically over how to access water and land. But the media, not least in Nigeria, will tend to take those conflicts and put them into a Christian-Muslim context. And that context gets picked up by the Western media, in part because there is no other media readily available. A small observation. When I was political counselor in Nigeria in the late 1980s, most of the major big American newspapers had correspondents that were either in Africa, either based in Africa, or visited there quite frequently. Now, American correspondents in Africa are largely confined to Dakar, Johannesburg, and Nairobi. In other words, we just simply know less now than we did then.
Throughout this conversation, we've been talking to a large extent about the continent of Africa, which is a regrettable necessity given the abstract terms and the sort of 30,000-foot perspective. But at the end of the day, it's a set of countries that are tremendously diverse and have their own different sets of governing principles and economies. And there have also been a lot of success stories of genuine, strong democracies emerging on the foundations of very good economies and governance models. So what kind of implications does that have for the kinds of recommendations you're making in your book?
I think the most important implication is one size does not fit all. And we cannot generalize over the entire continent from the dysfunctions of a Nigeria, a Central African Republic, a Congo, or an Ethiopia. Nor can we generalize over the whole continent. Those countries that have been remarkably successful, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Mauritius, Cape Verde, which as the years go by become yet more democratic and yet more firmly devoted to the rule of law. You have the two extremes, but there are also a lot of African countries that are to be found somewhere in between. That in turn requires the kind of granular knowledge of the host country that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. It's absolutely necessary if our policy and our diplomacy is to be successful.
John, thank you so much for making the time to come on Trendlines today.
Thank you so much for having me.
John Campbell is the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman, and Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.